Well, the federal government's intervention in Qantas was pretty swift, immediately invoking the emergency powers of the Fair Work Act and dragging all the parties into a hastily arranged session of arbitration that didn't start until about 10 o'clock last night. Now, having set the rules of engagement, the battle will be rejoined this afternoon, as we've just been discussing with Alan Joyce. Now, one observer who's been following this brawl at Qantas pretty closely is Professor Greg Bamber from the Faculty of Business and Management at Monash University, and he's also the author of Up in the Air, a study of how airlines around the world are battling the economic and industrial relations forces that are currently buffeting the aviation industry. And Professor Bamber joins me in the studio now. Well, Professor Bamber, have you ever seen anything like this before, looking at airline industries, and in fact any industries, sort of a full lockout grounding like this?
Well, there was an episode in the late 1980s where there was a dispute between the pilots and the domestic carriers here, Australian Airlines and Ansett, and those airlines did lock out the pilots at that stage and grounded the fleet, and it was grounded for months and months, and government intervened, so that in some ways that would be a precedent to this current incident. Obviously
it's under entirely different laws in those days. I mean, how does the Fair Work Australia Act, the Fair Work Act, apply now? I mean, the unions have 72 hours notice to provide before they go on strike, but it looks like the companies can give less notice before they go on strike.
Well, that's right, but the company is arguing that it was responding to the protected industrial action that the unions were taking, and that's why it took this immediate and very drastic action of grounding its whole fleet worldwide, which I would have thought wasn't the only option. Alan Joyce said he had no alternative, but...
So what other option would he have had?
He could have asked government to intervene, which government says it didn't receive that call. He could have given notice of such a grounding of the fleet. At the moment, we've got passengers around the world who are lying in airports with nowhere to stay, nowhere to go. Massive disruption to the whole network, which is going to do a huge amount of damage to the Qantas brand and reputation.
He's talked about the difference between termination and suspension. Can you just briefly explain what that difference is under the Fair Work Act?
Well, suspension is to provide a cooling off period, and that can happen when the parties argue, or the government has argued, that there's been significant economic damage, or the company is arguing that there is a safety consideration, and so it's had to ground the fleet because of safety considerations. Qantas is arguing now for a termination of industrial action by both sides, presumably. The unions are wanting a suspension for a limited period which would allow them to recommence the protected industrial action if the talks fail.
Now, you've been looking at airlines around the world and how they've been reforming themselves. Have any of them done it this way?
Well, British Airways, which is a similar legacy airline about the same age as Qantas, had a very long and damaging industrial dispute with its flight attendants over the period of the last couple of years. It's now come out of that and is trying to rebuild a relationship with its workforce. So that's a bit of a parallel. Another example that we look at in our book is Southwest Airlines in the United States, which is a younger airline. It was 40 years old, and it's developed a very close partnership with its workforce and the unions that represent its workforce. So they've had differences between them, but they've tried to work through these issues in a very constructive way as partners. And that's what I would encourage the parties in this dispute to do, not to waste this crisis, but to come out of this crisis and form a much better working relationship going forward into the future.
A long way to go to have a constructive partnership now, you would have thought?
Well, it is a long way to go, but sometimes a crisis will help to unfreeze entrenched positions, and this is a service sector industry. As you know from flying, we have very close contact with the people who work in the airline. It's very different from the mining industry, and I see the chairman of the board of this company came out of the mining industry.
That's Lee Clifford of Rio Tinto, who did reform the mining industry.
And when there were huge blues in the mining industry, huge industrial disputes in the Pilbara and elsewhere, but this is a service sector industry, and you can't operate it in the same way way that you can in a mining industry in remote communities.
Similar to the waterfront dispute of 1998, which, as you say, is also not a consumer brand in a way. It's in the background.
Well, that's right, and that's why my view is look at the experience of Southwest, which has grown to become the largest domestic airline in the United States. It's not had any retrenchments or redundancies. It's been profitable every year since its foundation. It's been a huge success story, and there are lessons that can be learned by Qantas and the unions here in how to proceed.
Well, look, I appreciate you coming in at short notice, Greg. Thanks very much for your wise words.
Thank you, Alan.